Hello and welcome to the Life is Story podcast. I'm Josh Olds, and today my guest is DL Mayfield, the author of The Myth of the American Dream. So Danielle, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, I always start out with this question because not all of my listeners are familiar with the author that I'm talking to or the book, and I want them so much to become familiar with those things. Who is D.L. Mayfield, and what is the myth of the American dream?
Oh, okay. Well, so I write as DL Mayfield, but my name is Danielle, and I am someone who lives on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon, and I teach English to speakers of other languages. I've lived in refugee and immigrant communities in the U.S. for about 14 years now, and it's totally rocked my world. And so I've written 2 books now, the second of which is The Myth of the American Dream, Reflections on Affluence, Autonomy, Safety, and Power. And it's really just a collection of essays where I am trying to understand how strong the values of the American dream have shaped my life and how powerful they are, and how contradictory they seem to the values of Jesus in the Gospels. And so really it's a book of wrestling and questions and trying to pay attention to inequality in my own neighborhood, and then sort of, broaden it out from there. It sounds kind of depressing when I say it like that, but I really am trying to be curious and pay attention, and I don't know. Hopefully it doesn't come across as like I'm telling you what to do, but I'm just trying to invite other people into, asking some questions about the Myth of the American Dream, which is an interesting book to have right now during a global pandemic and all of these protests about history of racial violence in the United States. It's a wild time, and I think most people now are like, yeah, we know, we get it.
Yeah. I think this book came out at a providential time because the things that you talk about in this book they've always been under the surface of the American life. And when I say under the surface, I mean for white evangelicals. They are fully on the surface and evident to any minority community in the United States. But by and large, white evangelicals can sort of overlook these things. And we've been faced with reality these past couple of months. And this book sort of shows us that this isn't about George Floyd only. This is about a whole history and system of inequality. And when we stand up to protest that inequality, then we are protesting not just an incident, but a system. And your book really shows us, I think, hopefully, how to not just react to a certain incident, but how to react chronically, how to react long term, and how to really live with these issues. So I really want to thank you for your work and for how much of yourself that you put into this book. This isn't just a book about here's what you should do, but this is a book about here's how I have lived, and I found that so refreshing.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing up the point that the myth of the American dream is only a myth for people who have chosen to believe in it. And you're exactly right that for anybody who's experienced the historic oppression baked into the United States, they've known this whole time and have been trying to tell us. So thank you for pointing that out. I think that's really important.
Now this has been a personal journey for you, because I don't think that what I gathered from the book is that you didn't necessarily grow up in this environment. So tell me about your childhood and your upbringing and how you got to where you are now.
Yeah, I think, taking a big step back and looking at this second book, I would say in some ways it's a book of me trying to grapple with the fact that I was raised very Christian, I'm a pastor's kid, I was homeschooled, I went to Bible college to be a missionary, so totally ensconced in this very conservative Christian white evangelical world. And, living in my neighborhoods, having experiences that I've had, I slowly started to realize that my religious community did not give me an adequate framework for the common good, for how do I live my life with the common good in my mind? How do I love my neighbor as myself? And in particular, the neighbor that is most at risk in my community. And I think that's like a huge scriptural theme. And then to see how people like white American evangelicals in particular, we don't have the language to live our lives like that. We truly have these values of, I need to do what's best for me and my family, you know, when it comes to mortgages, when it comes to school choice, when it comes to all these things. I really have seen how these values actually clash with what, you know, the scriptures are asking us to do. And I think that's why it's important, you know, you mentioned not just like getting on board with like activism or one specific thing happening. This book is really me saying, like, we have to look at these values that drive our lives, or else we're just going to keep repeating these mistakes. And I think what truly happens in a country like America, which is unequal and it is unjust, and it has been from the beginning. And, you know, before COVID-19, we really were on track as far as, like, income inequality levels. You know, we're moving towards the next Gilded Age as far as, like, extreme inequality, wealth inequality in the U.S. Mm-hmm. And, like, if we don't take that seriously, then people who do come from privileged backgrounds, like, when we choose what's best for us and our own, like, we just further that inequality and we actually harm the common good. You know, I live in a neighborhood, right, in Portland, and most cities are like this, where if someone is working full-time at a minimum wage job, like, they cannot pay their rent. They cannot pay their rent, right? And so what does that mean for me? That means, like, something is fundamentally wrong here. And we're just seeing it everywhere right now in the U.S., right? We don't have the funds to give people health care when we really need it right now. Like, we don't have the funds to help people pay their rent when they can't work for fear of dying. Like, it's such a huge mess. And I think as a Christian, I need to recognize, like, I have a responsibility to the common good, to all of my neighbors flourishing. And that is something that comes from the heart of God, this desire to see everybody flourish, not just me and not just my own. And so the book really was me trying to say, like, I'm confused. This is a scriptural thing. Why wasn't I taught that? And it's a sticky question to try and unravel.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that in my review of the book, and I'll be sharing a link along with this podcast when it is published, I said that above all, I don't know that your book changed any of my thoughts because I was already there, but it made me feel like here's someone else who understands. Like here's someone else who has gone through what I've gone through. Pretty similar upbringing within, you know, fully entrenched within conservative evangelical Christianity, homeschooled, and when I really began to study Scripture and what Jesus was saying and the themes of the Old Testament prophets, I'm just looking around going, that's not what our church is doing. We're not doing that, and I still don't know. I haven't found an answer to it other than that. We've just sort of co-opted Christ for our own purposes, and I guess that's probably the correct answer. But I don't know that it's one that it's not one that I want to put on the church, but I think it's probably the right one. For me, as I started to make this shift, I don't think my theology changed so much as the emphases of my theology changed. Because if you asked me, should we help the poor, I would have said yes. I may have had a different method of doing that. I may have had a different method of defining the poor. But so all of a sudden, my emphases start to shift. And I look around, and my social group and my family group, my church group, all those areas of support, they're no longer in the same place that I am. Did you find that as you started to engage in these areas of activism and justice?
Oh, yeah. I think fundamentally what changed for me, because, again, I grew up wanting to be a missionary, so I wanted to help people. And recognizing that, again, the framework I had been given within evangelicalism was one of charity, right? And so we help the poor because we have more than we need. But we never asked the question, why are people poor? You know, why are people poor in my city? Why are people poor globally, and we really didn't engage in a systemic framework. And so the first part of my book is looking at this value of affluence, and I thought it was a really important value to start off with because it's a great way to invite people like myself who did not grow up with an ability to engage in systems to instead, shift the conversation from like somebody's poor because they made a bad choice, which is how I was raised to think of it, to there's these entire systems at play that actually hoard wealth for some and then keep other people from wealth. And it's very systematic. And in the United States, it's actually all based upon race and gender and class. And so I think we have to really dig into the history, dig into these systems, and then start to say, like, I don't think God wants anybody to be poor. So how do we engage in that? And what's cool is going back and especially looking at, the Hebrew scriptures, is there's so much about why people are poor and how we can, create more just societies where we actually prioritize the most marginalized. So the Hebrew scriptures always talk about, the orphan, the widow, and the foreigner, and why we have to always keep them in our minds when we're making these decisions and we're making society, because those were the ones that were most at risk in the kind of, economic systems they had back then. Just like, oh my gosh, this is a part of our heritage. Why can't we as Christians be claiming that this is our heritage, an economic system that actually prioritizes the marginalized? And instead what we have is Christian financial gurus who literally say all the time, like, if you don't work, you shouldn't eat. I'm like, how is that a biblical response? And yet that's something that is just baked into sort of this privileged American dream mythology.
There's this idea that this is America, everyone's free, you can get ahead if you just work hard enough. And that, especially in a white evangelical's mindset, is, I think there's a lot of, well, if I can do it, then other people can do it. I know that I had that. I come from that background, and I kind of felt the same way for a long time. I paid off my student loans, so why should there be forgiveness for, these people? And I've had to change my mind on that, because I'm like, hey, the whole purpose here is to make society better. And if we are just dealing, if we leave these people only to deal with this crushing poverty, then they can't, it's harder for them to be the people who God has created them to be. And we have to, it's two things. It's generosity, but it goes beyond that, because we can be very generous and not change systems. Right. So starting with the systems, and this is, I'm asking you to answer an impossible question, but I guess really just where do we start?
Yeah, I think you just gave a great example, right? You worked hard, you paid off your student loans. I'm sure it wasn't easy for you. And, for a while it's sort of like, yeah, why should there be loan forgiveness for everybody else? I worked hard, I did it. Now your viewpoint has changed, and I'm assuming that's because you've been able to listen to stories of people who are not able to make it in this economic system that we have set up in the United States right now. And that's what happened for me. So what happens is we need to have this sort of shift and framework where we ask for God's dream for the world, to become our dream. And I think what you see in the scriptures over and over again is like, when the most marginalized flourish, we will all flourish. We actually all will be better for it. And I hear you saying that even in this little example of student loans. It's like when we experience, like when other people experience jubilee or debt forgiveness or liberation, like we truly all will be liberated. But what's interesting, this is a theme in scriptures too, is that, Jesus was good news, right, for certain groups of people. And for other groups of people, he was perceived as extremely threatening. And that's very important for us to pay attention to. So for me, as someone who loves creative writing, I love thinking about these values, I love thinking about these, that's where I like to start. It's like freedom and liberation sounds great, but the truth is it can feel like oppression to people who have benefited from systems that exploit other people, right? And so looking at Jesus, people tried to kill Jesus multiple times in the scriptures, and it was always the religious leaders, the people who had a lot to lose if suddenly everybody was in and everybody was God's child and everybody was loved by God. They'd spent their whole life trying to be like, no, we get it more than others and we have more access to God. And I see the same thing happening, in my own heart, in our own communities, is a lot of us work so hard to get where we are, and then it just feels like, oh my gosh, not everybody gets it, or I might be asked to give something up. And we need to pay attention to that. And, looking to the long picture, we know that in the end, true shalom, true justice, true flourishing is going to be best for all. Does that mean we need to give up some things here and now? I think it does. I talk a lot in the book about like school choice and thinking through how individualistic that has become for people who have choice, to choose what is best for you and your kid. And it might mean more of us need to make a decision based with our entire community at mind. And I truly don't think we're going to give up a lot, but the narrative is like, oh my gosh, this kid is not going to get the best education possible. And it's like, well, maybe scholastically, but what kind of education are they going to get in learning to love their neighbors? It's going to be awesome. So we just need to shift our mindset from what are we going to have to give up to what are we going to gain. And I think that's a shift I hear you saying that you've actually undertaken yourself. Do you think that's true for you?
It's super. Yeah. So in my life, I right in the middle of this pandemic, about a month and a half ago, then my wife and I, we both quit our jobs and we moved across the country, and we are currently living at a friend's house, and we are just waiting on what God has for us next. My wife's position is allows her to travel. Right now, it's all work from home. So we, in the middle of all this uncertainty, we had already planned this before coronavirus, and we just removed all stability in our life whatsoever and just stepped out on faith and said, okay, God, we knew you were calling us to do this even before the world got crazy, to do this crazy thing, and we're going to keep doing it. We're going to continue to do it anyway. And we gave away about 90% of everything that we owned, and we have enough possessions that could fill our 2 cars, and that includes our 2 children and their things as well. And that's how we're going to live the next couple of years, just to see where God takes us in the world. And it has been, it's been interesting. It's been interesting. I don't know that we've really achieved it yet, because we're still really within sort of these social safety nets, and that we're living at a friend's house. We're about an hour away from my parents. But eventually, and these are the conversations that we've been having over the course of the last 3-4 weeks, as we look toward what comes after this, is how crazy do we get? How extreme do we go? Where is God going to take us? And right now we're just kind of willing to be open to everything. One thing we did at the start of this year is we really had this we had this feeling that we wanted to love our neighbor as ourselves. And so we started with our food budget. And every month, whatever it is that we have spent on food, whether that's restaurants or grocery, we have been giving that to various organizations that work to combat hunger, whether globally or locally. And that has been I haven't missed that money, I haven't missed it. And I thought I was going to. And I wasn't sure I wanted to do it. And whenever we get ready to click the button to send the money, I still have that sense of I don't know. And in 7 months now, I've not missed that money whatsoever. And it has been incredible to me, because I never would have considered myself to be affluent, but I must be, Yeah. I must be. And I guess I've kind of gotten off track, but here's a question I want to ask you, because this is kind of where what I've been wrestling with over the past year or so, is how much is too much? Do you have guidelines for yourself on how much money you live off of, or what you allow for entertainment and luxuries?
Yeah, I think this is a really big question. I think you just gave a really cool example of how we can actually be creative in thinking through how we want to view money. That's a really awesome idea. Like, and for one, you're having to pay attention to how much money you're spending, right, on
Correct,
food,
yeah.
stuff, and then you are, forcing yourself to give out of your abundance, and maybe not even out of your abundance, but actually just like out of your what you're using. So for me, our finances fluctuated so much over the past decade. It's unreal. And so we don't like have a set budget that we live at or under. But for me, the thing that's been so impactful is living in a neighborhood where most people are in poverty. My daughter attending a school where 94% of the people live below the poverty line. I feel like that just naturally changes how I view money and how I view spending. And so I feel like my neighbors are the constraint, right, upon my life, and it helps me to have a more accurate grasp of how people are living. And so, yeah, I want to continue to be more generous. I would say that I really struggle with generosity, and I think I still have a really huge scarcity mindset when it comes to money. I'm really afraid of losing all the money I have because I live in America. If I have one terrible thing happen to me health-wise, right?
Right.
I'm
Yeah.
gonna be bankrupt.
Yeah.
That's how most people live. That's how I live. But for me, I think it's really important to have a more biblical perception of money. And I read about this in the book, and the Bible says so much about money and wealth. And there's some conflicting stuff in there. One thing is that wealth is a blessing from God, and we need to express our gratitude for it. And that's really hard for me, right? I feel a little bit ashamed of money. I feel ashamed that my husband's a therapist and he makes a decent living, But I need to express gratitude. If I don't express gratitude, then I'm going to continue to hoard it or feel shame and all that. And that's not good. And then the other thing the Bible really talks about a lot, these are like the two main things, is that wealth makes us forget the poor. So we have to hold those things in tension at all times. It's a blessing from God. It can make us forget about the poor. So we have to view it as a both and, And so for me, it's just important to be in conversation with people about money, to have more frank discussions about money. I write in the book about doing a little group with some of our friends where we actually talked about our money and how we want to spend and how we want to be more generous, because you have to be strategic about being generous. But again, some of these discussions kind of stem back to that individualistic thing, which I don't think is bad. But we do need to keep having this conversation of, and why is it so hard for us to be generous? Is it because we live in a consumeristic, capitalistic society, where we can never quite get ahead? And I want to keep both of those conversations in tension. What I do with my money is important, but what's also extremely important is changing the system to prioritize people over capital. And I think we're seeing the need for that right now.
Yeah, for sure. You've brought up this issue of autonomy a few different times, and that is the next section in your book. And you wrote this book again before COVID, before the pandemic, but the conversation on autonomy really has taken on a new facet in American life, and how we have dealt with this pandemic, and my belief and why we are still dealing with it in the way that we are, because we are such an individualistic society.
Yeah.
How do we? I mean, I don't even know how to start to try to, especially because there's such a reaction to any sort of collectivism, any sort of idea of a social structure or social justice. Immediately brings up these accusations of socialism, communism. The idea of individualism is so entrenched in American life that it becomes very difficult for us to have empathy for the needs of other people. When we can't even begin to have this conversation because of the extremes that it immediately gets taken to, where do we even begin?
Yeah, I think for me it's just horrifying to read the news headlines and to see, I would say the values of both Affluence and our economic system must keep going at all costs, and autonomy, like, it's a deadly concoction. It's literally deadly, as we are seeing. The United States is now the leader in, deaths from COVID-19, and it's just going to climb. And so when I see the headlines, when I see people, refusing to wear a mask because of their right to personal liberty, I'm just like, we live in Pharaoh's world. We're living in Pharaoh's Egypt, from Hebrew scriptures. And Pharaoh said, like, we must keep building at all costs. We must keep moving forward at all costs. And, those who don't make it, they were the weak and the infirm anyways, And it's just like, wow, that is the opposite of God's dream for the world. And I think you're exactly right. I've been really privileged to live in these neighborhoods with refugees and immigrants who come from collectivist cultures. And just seeing, like, oh my gosh, they are so much better equipped to handle a global pandemic. It's not even funny. And so the first step, right, for people who are kind of entrenched in these ideas of American superiority is to say, like, let's look at the countries who are doing this better. All of them have a collectivist socialist, bent to them, and it's really helping their societies.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that of course brings up the issue of safety. Which I find there's almost this like paradox here in that it's our individualism that is keeping us from being safe. Yeah. And yet we still place a very high value on our safety. Yeah. That is, especially white people, and that is I think a large contingent of the audience of this podcast, white Christians. So we're talking directly to you. We tend, and I'll say we like to live in safety, and everyone does. Mm-hmm. But the more affluent you are, the greater the ability you have to create that safety, and to also, whether it's safe or not, you may have developed ideas in your mind of what isn't safe, whether that's the case or not. Like, oh, it's not safe in this particular neighborhood. I feel safe when I am the majority culture. Mm-hmm. So it's not necessarily so much about physical safety, but it's almost like emotional safety. Mm-hmm. We want to live where we feel comfortable. White people aren't used to being in the minority, and one thing that you've done, you said you've lived in minority communities, you have lived in refugee communities. Did you have any difficulty adjusting initially to that, and how are you with it now?
I think in the beginning it was just really exciting and really fun. And, I'm someone who does enjoy other cultures, and I don't think I'd live in neighborhoods like this if I didn't enjoy it in some respects. However, truly being the minority somewhere is difficult. And so I've had to become comfortable with difficulty. I have had to really deal with my own white fragility and the limitations I have. And so that's, ultimately it's all a gift. It's just all a gift. Right now during COVID-19, I'm not able to really engage with my neighbors very much at all. And it's been very difficult. And sort of like a sliver of a gift of this is like I'm still being forced to reckon with the fact that I still have a lot of like savior complex impulses, right? Like right. I'm only a valuable person if I'm helping my neighbors, and I'm not able to do that right now. And am I still loved and valued by God? And am I still using my neighbors to feel better about myself? I'm having to deal with all that right now. But I will say, when I wrote the safety section of the book, I was really looking at how people who are privileged, sort of have a warped sense of safety, right, and what constitutes safety. And I was really looking at how the conversation has devolved around immigration and refugees in particular, because obviously that's really important to me and a community I've worked with for a long time now, of how immigrants, historically have been vilified in public discourse. And, Donald Trump and his 2016 election, like, most people voted for him, in a large part due to his immigration policies, right? They want to build the wall. They want to keep out immigrants who are not Eurocentric. They want the refugee resettlement program to end. And in large part, that's happened. Like, my life is drastically changed. Like, I have my master's degree in teaching English to speakers of other languages, and I specialize in teaching non or pre-literate communities. So they're mostly women who were too poor or experienced some kind of trauma in their own country. They never learned to read or write. And that's what I've done. And now there's nobody coming, right? And this is even before the pandemic. There's nobody new coming. It's over. And even if for some reason Trump decided to let a bunch of refugees in, there's no infrastructure now to support them. And it's like, wow, they really did it. This historic human rights, amazing refugee resettlement program has been decimated for the next 10 years, I would say, at least. Mm-hmm. And so it's sort of trying to grapple with that grief and how us saying, like, we want to be safe, America first, only focus on us, like, this has such dire and drastic consequences that I don't think people are really acknowledging. And so that's truly what I was focusing on in this section. But you're right, now we're in this, like, very bizarre time of, like, we're actually seeing that people value, I would say, affluence and autonomy over public safety at this point, right? It's just a wild time.
Yeah, for sure. You have two young kids. I don't know exact ages. I think young. I have two young kids. How do you balance the desire to, like, you have to be a parent, but also you want to place yourself into these situations of instability and uncertainty? How do you keep your kids safe and make sure that their needs are taken care of while also still going out and advocating on behalf of the most vulnerable?
Yeah, I mean, I think our neighborhood is really safe because we know everybody. Sometimes I drive through, like, a more affluent suburb, and I'm just like, it's so creepy. Do people even know their neighbors? Like, everybody knows us. We know them. We watch out for each other. It's, like, an incredibly safe place to live. I think this question has come up more for me with, regards to schooling. Mm-hmm. I have, like, a 9-year-old and a 5-year-old, and one of my children is, like, super highly gifted and, has all this other stuff that maybe would make a chaotic school classroom not super great. But, honestly, it's been going amazing. And I'm actually, this moment today, I'm really grieving the fact that we probably will not have in-person school this fall. And, our school is, like, our hub of community. And I actually am going to have to, like, homeschool my children, which I swore I would never do after being homeschooled myself. But yeah, I think we have to, it's not like I don't care about my kids and their safety at all. That's not true. But I'm just trying to, branch out a little bit and say, as I'm thinking about what's best for my kids, I need to keep in mind my neighbors. And so going back to the school thing, I don't really want to tell people what to do. I mean, that's not true. I do think most people should follow. And we need to engage with the fact that we have an incredibly segregated and unequal school system in the United States, and that's on purpose, and we need to wrestle with that. But, really what I just want us to be able to ask is, instead of just saying what's best for my child, let's ask some other questions. Like, somebody's kids, right, have to go to the worst school in your city. So, like, in your mind, whose kid should that be? The truth is, like, the worst school in the city should be good enough for your child, right? Or else there's something fundamentally wrong. So therefore, we need to engage in these issues to make it good for everybody. And what instead happens is, when we focus on our own, we totally opt out of these discussions of the common good. And that's what I want to see change. That doesn't mean you neglect your own kids, but you have to really do the work to enter into these larger frameworks. What's going to be best for all of God's children, not just my own.
Yeah, I remember it's been probably a year and a half ago that the city that I was living in at the time, the county jail was being used as an ICE detention center for refugees. And usually when the refugees had been processed and they were released to be wait on their court date, then it was in the middle of the afternoon. But for whatever reason, and who knows why, I'm sure no good reason, they had a group of people who were released around midnight, And so we got a phone call that was just like, hey, no one can come out and help these people get to the airport or get to the bus station. And, they're just okay, here you go. Now you're outside of the jail with nothing. Good luck getting to your next destination. So a group of us had gone down to make sure that all their paperwork was correct, that they had been given everything that they needed, that they knew they were in contact with their lawyers, and that they were getting to their next destination, to wherever it is that they were going to be staying at until their court date. And so, my wife and I were just like, okay, so we put our kid in the car. He's like 1 year old at the time. And, we just went down to the jail and hung out in front of the jail and waited for this group of about a dozen refugees to be processed and released. And, I'm telling friends about it, and they're like, oh, you took your child? Yeah, I mean, it was fine. There was no sense of danger here at all. But there was this idea of that's not where you take a child. Mm-hmm. And my kid had a great time, and the refugees that he played with, in the grass there in front of the jail as we waited to make sure everyone was processed to take them to the airport, was a I think that evening was a life-changing experience for me. Mm-hmm. in saying like, okay, you can both be a parent and still engage with the world. It makes it more difficult, for sure. Yeah. I know I had a lot of my single friends or friends without children were very involved in protests this past month, and my wife and I not so much. And that was more because I will take my kids to hang out with refugees because I trust them. I will not take my kid to go hang out where there might be a violent police presence because I don't trust that. Right. In just for myself, trying to find that balance of both. I want to take care of my children to make the next generation better. But if I only do that and I don't take care of other people and other people's children, then I'm only making the world better for myself, and that's so anti-gospel. That's so anti-Christian.
Right. Yeah.
So I feel like we could just like talk forever on this and just sort of, I don't know that we're getting anywhere, but we can just commiserate, Yeah. There's this idea of like we have so far to go. And I just hope that if people read this book, it'll ignite something in them to say, I need to be a part of this. I need to engage in this. One of the things that's been super difficult, I think, over the past couple of months is burnout. You wake up and there are 20 things that you could devote your attention to, or devote your platform to, or your voice to. And each of them, they're all interconnected, they're all interrelated, they're all super important. And especially as white people, I have the privilege of being able to step away if I want. Mm-hmm. I don't have to always advocate on behalf of the poor because I'm not poor. I don't always have to advocate on behalf of racial minorities because I'm not a racial minority. So I have the privilege of being able to step back. How do you avoid burnout, and is it okay to step back sometimes?
Yeah, I think I was getting really good at like avoiding burnout in my normal pre-COVID-19 life, and so now I'm feeling a little like I want to throw a hissy fit because I'm not good at avoiding burnout in this pandemic life. Yeah. But I will say, of course it's okay to step back. Like, we have to prioritize mental health. This is an absolutely unprecedented moment. Now, there's different ways of stepping back, right? There's one of, like, I just want to pretend like this doesn't exist. And there's a way of stepping back to say, like, you know what, I want to be in this for the rest of my life, and I need to build some resiliency, right? And I don't think white people have a ton of resiliency, right, when it comes to engaging in systemic
Yeah.
unjust framework. So I think building resiliency is great. All of us probably need to pay attention. Like, are we numbing out, or are we actually engaging in like restorative practices that will build resiliency? I would say, like, for me, probably the biggest thing, and it's so hard because we're so isolated because of this. It's truly a perfect storm, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
But I would say the most positive way I've been able to reframe it is, for one, I don't think we're going to go back to business as usual, which is good. Business as usual sucked for a lot of people. And so I think we could be excited that things are changing. We are seeing some real cultural shifts happening in front of our eyes. And then as a Christian, I can just say, you know what? I'm angry and I'm sad and I hate all that's going on that's so wrong in the world, because I'm one of God's children, and God's dream for the world is for everyone to flourish, every single person. And this dream is not something I made up. It's not something that is pie in the sky. It actually comes from God, and I get to be this tiny little part of dreaming up, God's will being done on earth as it is in heaven. God's will is incredible. It's incredible for everybody. And so I can really, as much as I am really sad and disappointed with a lot that was given to me through my cultural Christianity, it's been really great to sort of reclaim this core tenets of a global historic Christianity, which is God's obsessed with our neighbors, God's obsessed with our neighbors flourishing. And I get to be part of that. And that's really exciting. And that's something I want to do my whole life. And so I'm going to try and approach that with joy while I can. And so for me, I do need that reframing. Even getting the chance to talk to you is really helpful for me because, of course I can get stuck on my phone and doom scrolling and looking at all the bad things. But, we can connect with other people and say, we're not the only ones who are thinking these things through and who feel this desire for a better world, than the one we currently have. And, we can encourage each other in that.
Mm-hmm. So this question has been one that's been on my mind the past few weeks. Is there ever a point, 'cause I honestly, truly do not know the answer to this. Is there ever a point where you would just say, I wash my hands of this. I give up on the United States. I mean, all nations have their issues, but I'm gonna go somewhere else. Is there ever a point that you would do that?
Oh my gosh, how honest do I want to be about this question? I think about that a lot for a few reasons, and I would say the biggest reason for me is that I have, spent my life working with recently arrived refugees, and I have to be honest and say, that's over at this point. And so I really have to sort of wrestle between like two different vocations. So I do some writing, and like speaking and stuff to white evangelical Americans. And so obviously I still think that's sort of an important thing, but it's just one part of my life. And so the other part of my life, teaching English, building communities, is sort of like, that's over. At what point do you say, like, if I truly want to learn how to be hospitable and welcoming to people who've experienced forced migration, then the United States is actually not a place where I can do that work anymore. So yes, of course I have Googled what it's like to move to New Zealand, because New Zealand, per capita welcomes way more refugees. It has 0 cases of COVID-19. Our friends who live there, their kids are already back in school. Yeah, so I've done that. I'm not making any decisions now, but it's so sobering to realize my way of life and my way of trying to live out part of my vocation as a Christian and just as a neighbor is over. And I'm still grappling with that. Yeah.
It's so hard because I've kind of felt I felt exactly the same way. And again, New Zealand, you're at the top of my list, so we're coming for you. Although right now I understand you're not letting any Americans anywhere near your country.
Exactly.
We're sorry. We're trying. Not all of us, but a few of us.
Yeah, I was like, we're not all trying.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, but I've really felt the same way in that is there a point at which you're like, the system is too broken, the best way to fix it is to start over somewhere else? And I honestly, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know. I don't know. When I think about where I want my kids to grow up, and I guess that is sort of an element of safety that I still harbor. I have 2 adopted children who are racial minorities. Do I want them to live in this America? Do I want them to have to go through the things that I have seen people of their race go through? If I can preach the gospel and have the same impact in a country where they're going to be more accepted, it's I guess it's kind of utilitarian, but it's like, where can I do the most work? Am I called to the United States? And I don't know anymore. I don't know, and I don't know where I'll end up on that in my life.
I mean, we're on the same boat. I think all we can do right now is sort of lean into the fact of lamenting, how broken our country is in our states and our cities, and we can't fix it. And we can't even move away right now because of how things are. So all we can do is sort of sit and lament, right, this reality. And I think that will continue to shape us, no matter, obviously only privileged people can make those decisions about what they're going to do next. But for now, we can all just say, like, this sucks.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. So let's try to pivot a little bit, and let's end on a positive note. This is like, I want to point this out for those of you who are listening. This is hard work, and we cannot look away from it simply because it is hard, or because it is difficult, because it makes us uncomfortable. These things are supposed to make us uncomfortable. And when we look at that and we see, why does this make us uncomfortable, it's not until we feel uncomfortable that we're going to fix anything. And unfortunately, that's the case. That's the way the American psyche is sort of set up, is that when we ourselves are personally affected by it, then we will feel a greater inclination to be a part of the solution. It's so easy to look away when it doesn't affect us. And the hope is that we don't want you to come away from this, I'm not saying read this book to feel sad or listen to this podcast and feel sad. We want you to feel energized from this, because we need more people in this fight, because there's going to be times of burnout. There's going to be times that people have to step away. But if I can step away for a day and 5 people take my place, then that's when we're really going to affect lasting change. And hopefully, I don't want to give up. I don't want to give up on this country. This country has provided a lot for me, despite its flaws, despite its historic injustices. And I think that we can fight to make it better. I think we can fight so that the ideals of this nation, that we are all equal under God, can actually be realized. But it's going to take the church being the church, and it's going to take some deeply, deeply sacrificial changes, not just to us as individuals, but to us as societies. So just let's sort of end on, I hope, a positive note. And I want to ask is what, and you may not know because of everything that's uncertain in the world today, but what do you have upcoming? Do you have any plans for any future writing?
Oh, I do, but it's a hard thing for me, staring down the barrel of my kids not going to school, and it was going to be my first year with both of my kids in school, and I was really excited about writing another book, but
it's hard to write with kids, I know.
No, I mean, I've done it, but
Yeah.
not with kids, like, during a pandemic where we can't do anything else, you know, so.
Yeah.
I don't really know what's coming. I will say, you know, I have had this practice of, you know, I'm pretty good at, like, despairing about the state of the world, but when I look at all my heroes, you know, heroes of the faith or whatever, like, they're also really good at being on the lookout for God's presence and joy in their lives. And so that's something I need to continually remind myself, is that there is joy in this life and there's joy in this work. But if you kind of numb yourself to the bad news, you're probably going to numb yourself to the joy of God's presence at work too. So just, you know, taking a moment to say, I want it all. I want to experience the good and the bad, the delight and the despair. And so that's kind of how I'm going to keep telling myself to move forward. There's going to be some good things coming in all of this too.
Mm-hmm. I'll close with this quote, and then I'll let you comment on it. Very near the end of the book, in the epilogue, you quote Walter Brueggemann, who writes that poets have no advice to give people. They only want people to see differently, to revision life. They are not coercive. They only try to stimulate, hint, give nuance, not more. They cannot do more because they are making available a world that does not yet exist beyond their imagination. What does that quote mean to you?
Yeah, I think coming from somebody who wanted to be a missionary, it's just like, I really have this impulse to just want to convert everybody to be like me, think like me, you know, live their life like me. And instead really being called to this larger thing, which is, you know, what Walter Brueggemann would call the prophetic imagination. How do I start to cultivate an imagination that is not influenced by Pharaoh or Empire or the United States or the myth of the American dream? How can I start to cultivate this holy imagination? And that's what I want. I love how, you know, the Hebrew word for prophet means to bubble up. Like, prophets are just people who help what's been hidden under the surface bubble up to the top. And so I guess we're kind of closing out this interview with how we started, which is, you know, the myth is being laid bare for everyone right now. How can we be a part of keeping that, to keep bubbling that up and to keep saying, is there another way we can live our life? And as someone who loves creative writing, you know, I would encourage people listening to this to just try and pay attention, you know, if there's images in the news, if there's something that stands out to you, to really take a moment to think about it. You know, I have friends who have, like, painted pictures of the Statue of Liberty, and, you know, the words on the Statue of Liberty, right, give us your tired and poor and huddled masses, and really use that experience of painting the Statue of Liberty, which is sort of like, you know, none of that's happening right now, but, you know, engaging in that in an artistic way of, like, lamenting that, or, you know, looking at a picture of police in their full riot gear, you know, and just taking a moment to say, like, this is where my tax dollars go, you know, is to provide weapons of militarization to people, you know, just really taking some time to think about our imaginations, how they're shaped, and to let it keep bubbling up, even if we just kind of want to go and bury our heads in the sand.